Up first on Winzenburg on the Weekend is Don Walton. Don is the author of Our Weird, Wonderful Ancestors, and this is very appropriate for this weekend since we're all talking about our freedom and our independence, and Don has written a book where he talks about the soap opera stories from the 1700s. Don, thanks for being with us on WHO.
Good to be here.
And we saw that the Declaration of Independence just sold for over $8 million this last week, so people are still obviously very interested in our forefathers. But Don, I think you uncovered some things that people may be shocked by. Whatever got you onto this?
Well, my wife and I lived in the Philadelphia suburbs some time back in the 1970s, and we got interested in that. In fact, she belonged to a women's club that met in an old building that was built before the war, before 1776. It had been a Quaker meeting house, and then George Washington took it over as a hospital. And, of course, it's still there today. Those things don't fall down. And the heavy oak floors still have blood stains from the wounded soldiers.
Sure.
And there's a little cemetery in the backyard where we used to meet and so on. And so I got interested, and we'd go shopping at Valley Forge or King of Prussia and go to the Brandywine battlefield and see Lafayette's house. And so I got interested in the stories of that time and discovered that many of them were not the way we thought they were.
That's an understatement. After reading this book, I cannot think about any of the forefathers in the same way. I mean, they're just completely different. They're very wild. We got gamblers and alcoholics and womanizers.
Well, things haven't changed, Steve.
Yeah. What we see going on in Washington today was going on back then a couple hundred years ago. Many of our kids are being taught things in schools. We were all raised in school with certain myths, I guess. Do you think kids are being taught myths today when it comes to our historical ancestors?
Well, I don't know. I guess they involve some myths. It involves more eliminating things that we perhaps don't want them to think about. But in doing so, I think we dehumanize the historical characters. They were real people. George Washington, who was a wonderful man, perhaps the greatest American who ever lived, he was human too, and I don't mean that he got involved in scandals. He was a straight arrow, but he loved to dance. He was the life of the party. We think of him as a taciturn person who never spoke much and sort of glowered at people.
Well, he did gamble, didn't he? He was a card player.
He loved to gamble, and he was a bad gambler. He kept track of every cent he spent, in his diaries, and
also,
he lost more money than he won. Which
he also had to give out alcohol in order to win votes.
You had to in his first election.
Oh, everybody had to.
He tried to get by without handing out any drinks, and he lost. And the second time, he gave a quart and a half of liquor to everybody who'd vote for him, and of course, so he got elected. So,
are you saying that Washington bought the election to the Virginia House?
I guess you could say that, but everybody did. So,
are you serious?
Well, they say things haven't changed much. Now it's hundreds of millions of dollars. Then it was a few bottles of liquor. I mean, which is worse? That's
amazing. Don Walton is the author of Our Weird, Wonderful Ancestors. In just a little bit, we're going to be opening up the phone lines because we've got a really fun history quiz about our forefathers from the 1700s. We're going to be giving you the quiz and giving away some copies of Don's book this morning. But Don, let's get into some of this. I guess I have to start with Benjamin Franklin because that's what shocked me the most.
Oh, wonderful guy.
Oh, my gosh. I just cannot believe him. I mean, he obviously was a womanizer, but beyond that, try to explain his marital situation to me.
Well, it was rather strange. He was sort of engaged to a woman, and then he went to England, was trying to get involved in the printing business and was trying to raise money there. So he said to her, I have to leave for a while, and I don't know when I'll be back. Well, of course, that queered any talks of marriage, and she gave up on him and married somebody else who was a no-good, who spent her money, and she left him, and he disappeared. Well, then Franklin came back from England and wanted to resume this relationship, and they decided they would sort of get married, but they couldn't because it would have been bigamy. She didn't know if her legitimate husband would show up again. Fortunately, he never did.
So she left her first husband and got together with Franklin.
Yeah, they became common law man and wife, and he called her Mrs. Franklin.
Right.
But then they lived together for years and years, but they never really were married.
And try to explain his son, because his son was not by that woman.
Well, somewhere in there, before he got married, he impregnated somebody and had an illegitimate son, which was raised by his new wife. And so that was the
What a
first
weird-
of the illegitimate kids in the Franklin line, and that continued. In fact, John Adams, who had a sort of a bitter mouth and didn't approve of a lot of things, once said that Franklin was the founder of a dynasty of bastards.
Oh.
And, of course, literally this was true, because he had an illegitimate son, William, who had an illegitimate son, Temple, who had a couple of illegitimate children.
Wow.
So it sort of went down through the generations.
And yet he's considered a brilliant man. How brilliant can he be if he had that marital situation or lack of marital situation? Then, of course, he was a womanizer. He didn't attend his wife's funeral. I was very surprised by that. They told him that his wife died, and he never came back for her funeral.
Well, he knew she was ill, but he didn't come back until a couple of months after she died, or started back. And, of course, it took you another month or month and a half to get back over the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
He arrived after that. But he, as you say, he couldn't be a brilliant man. He was fantastic. You know, he had 2 years of formal education, and then he taught himself after he got involved in the printing business with his brother and discovered the world of books. He taught himself to read Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, and German. He taught himself to read and play music. He invented a musical instrument which was very popular in those days, the harmonica or glass harmonica, and Beethoven and Mozart wrote music for it. It was Marie Antoinette's favorite instrument. Of course, he invented all sorts of things.
Right.
We wouldn't be on the radio today, if it weren't for his discoveries about electricity. He was the most famous scientist in the world.
And yet he had lots of weaknesses.
Yeah, lots of weaknesses.
Very similar to some of our leaders in Washington today.
Well, I was thinking that if Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton had lived in those days, they wouldn't have been considered that unusual, maybe a little bit mild.
And yet these are people with very strong weaknesses. I mean, does it come together? I mean, if you're brilliant, do you also have huge weaknesses?
I don't know. Maybe they're even a little more prevalent among the brilliant political people, and perhaps it's because they relate to people. They're outgoing. And I guess that would be a mild way of calling it, outgoing. But they charmed a lot of people. Hamilton, Burr, Benedict Arnold, for example, was supposed to be a charmer. That might be hard to consider, but of course he was our most brilliant general before he got involved in heavy debts, and a young wife who was the friend of the chief spy of the British Army, and there just was a lot of that going on. It's just human nature, I guess.
Did Americans back then know that this was going on? Did the public know?
Oh, they were pretty well informed, because there were many tabloids that sort of resembled the tabloids you see in the supermarkets, and they concentrated on scandals.
Oh, they did?
All of it was put out. I mean, there wasn't anything that happened that wasn't reported, and of course some of it wasn't even true, but they found stories to put in the papers. Then, as now, people like to read about what their famous friends were doing. You know?
But didn't it impact their political careers?
Not too much. I know there's one quote that in my book that I like. It was about Alexander Hamilton, who was probably the raunchiest of the politicians, and he got involved with first it was a financial scandal. See, he was Secretary of Treasury after the war, and he was accused, along with others, of profiting by the soldiers' bonuses. The soldiers were promised money after the war. They probably weren't paid, and they were going to get a certain amount of money. Well, they never got it. It was a promise. They never got it right then. So speculators would come in and offer a soldier for his $100 bonus. They'd offer him $1, and he'd take it, see? And then they'd keep it and collect on it later. But this was not a nice thing to do. Well, Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, was accused by one of these speculators as being a partner with him in one of these raunchy schemes.
Right.
And he said, no, that's not true. He said, James Reynolds is just angry with me. And he said, the reason he's angry is because I've been sleeping with his wife.
So he admitted it.
He said further, he knew about this. He actually set it up, and he and his wife, Maria, have been blackmailing me.
Wow.
I've been paying him money, which was proved later. And he said, and now he's mad because I won't pay him any more money. Well, this created a little bit of a scandal. sort of surprised him, I guess.
But he kept office.
Yeah, but then there was comments about this, and General Cobb, who was a famous person at that time, said, quote, Hamilton has fallen for the present, but if he fornicates with every female in the cities of New York and Philadelphia, he will rise again, for purity of character in politics is not necessary. And I guess he was right.
That's a sad quote. Purity of character in politics is not necessary. Don Walton is our guest. Isn't that very contemporary, even though that's from a couple hundred years ago? Don Walton is the author of the book. It's called Our Weird, Wonderful Ancestors. And Don, let's get to the phone lines. We're going to ask him some questions, okay?
Okay.
Here we go. Dixie's up first. Good morning, Dixie.
Hi.
Are you a Southerner, Dixie?
No, not that I know of.
Who named you Dixie?
My dad.
And he lived up north?
Well, no, I used to live in Des Moines. But for some reason, he liked the song Dixie Doodle.
Was that something? Dixie, here's your question. How many teeth did George Washington have at his death? Was it 0, 1, or 4?
Oh, gosh, I'm going to guess 4.
Nope.
No?
You didn't have 4. Good try. Thanks for listening, Dixie. Brian, you get a chance at that one. Hi, Brian.
Yeah, it was 0.
Nope, it wasn't 0, but thanks for trying. Ralph's up next on Winzenburg on the Weekend. You been listening, Ralph?
He had 1 tooth.
Very smart. Good job. Don, tell us about that.
Oh, yes, he ended up with just 1 tooth.
Isn't that
and
amazing?
Of course, that was the reason he didn't smile much or talk a lot, or one reason. He was afraid they'd fall down. Of course, you know, they didn't have plastics in those days, so you didn't have tight-fitting teeth.
Mm-hmm.
And the way to keep them separate, they were probably metal plates, usually like silver plates, that had teeth stuck in it, often cow's teeth or human teeth that they'd pulled out of somebody else that were pretty good shape.
And you said that he always had trouble with his teeth,
yeah,
right?
And they put a silver spring in it to keep them apart. For example, Paul Revere, who was a silversmith, built at least one set of teeth for George Washington. He had several, and they were ivory teeth, usually on a metal plate.
Wow. He only had 1 actual tooth left in his mouth when he died.
One other thing about that, everybody had false teeth in those days, but John Adams hated his false teeth. And so when he was in the White House as president, he would meet people in his office with no teeth in his mouth. He just wouldn't wear the things. Can you imagine that? And I'll bet his smile was a killer, too.
They didn't have TV cameras back then.
Yeah, he lisped when he talked.
Okay, Marcia's up next with our guest, Don Walton, the author of Our Weird, Wonderful Ancestors. Hi, Marcia.
Hi.
Here's your question. Which flamboyant dresser who signed the Declaration of Independence was called the Purple Patriot? He dressed in purple. Was it Ben Franklin, John Hancock, or Thomas Jefferson?
Oh, it was John Hancock.
You got it. Very good. And Don, I cannot believe some of the stories you have in there of the way people dressed. They didn't seem to be embarrassed by anything.
Well, John Hancock was also called the Merchant Prince because he was criticized because they said he dressed like the nobles or like the king, who, of course, he was fighting. And, for example, there's one of these fashion statements in one of the tabloids that said John Hancock came in wearing a red velvet cap, a blue damask cape lined with velvet, a white lace stock that goes around your neck, a white satin gold-embroidered waistcoat, black satin small clothes, which are knee breeches, red Morocco slippers, and white silk stockings.
Wow.
Can you imagine that?
No.
The richest man in New England, and he dressed like it. He loved party clothes.
Well, thanks, Marcia. You stay tuned because we're going to be giving 2 of our winners copies of the book, okay?
Okay.
Thanks a lot. And Marilyn's up next. Hi, Marilyn.
Hello.
Ready for your question?
You ready?
And Marilyn, who called his wife My Dear Patsy? He called his wife My Dear Patsy. Was it John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, or George Washington?
Jefferson.
Nope. Good guess. It's not Jefferson. Barbara, you get a chance at that. Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Who called his wife Patsy? Was it John Adams, George Washington, or Thomas Jefferson?
John Adams.
Nope. Thanks for trying. See, that's why I knew this was going to be a surprise. Josh, have you been paying attention?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Who called his wife Patsy? Was it Adams, Washington, or Jefferson?
Washington.
You got it. That wasn't too hard, was it, Josh?
No, sir.
Okay. Don, tell us the story about that.
Well, of course, that was a common nickname for Martha, so Martha was called Patsy.
But none of us really think about that. We always think of her as Martha Washington.
Yeah.
But he just called her Patsy. Thanks, Josh, for tuning to WHO. John is up next. Good morning, John.
Hi.
You're ready for...
Washington.
Sorry, that was the last question, John.
Okay.
Okay, John. Who was the vice president who killed the Secretary of Treasury? Now, this is... Think about it. It's not too hard. Who was the vice president who killed the Secretary of Treasury? This was while they were in office.
Okay.
Was it Alexander Hamilton, Samuel Adams, or Aaron Burr?
Aaron Burr.
That's right. Right. Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton. And, Don, I was surprised to see in your book that Hamilton not only was killed in the duel, but Hamilton's son also had been killed in a duel.
There were many duels, yes, and Hamilton's son actually had used the same pistol that Hamilton used or didn't use.
Was a duel legal?
Oh yes, as long as it's supposed to be on a fair basis. Why, the people agreed to duel. If you got killed, that was rough.
But the vice president killed the Secretary of the Treasury. They were in office at the time, didn't they?
That's right, but that finished Burr's career.
But he stayed vice president until he finished his term, didn't he?
Yes.
Right. I mean, just think of that, folks. Think of how shocking it was.
He was exonerated. They had an inquiry, and he said, well, it was a duel, so it was okay.
Yeah.
But everybody figured he murdered Hamilton, so that sort of ended his career.
Thanks, John, for listening. Stay tuned to WHO Radio. We've got Ralph, John, Marcia, and Josh who've already won. We've got more callers who are going to get a chance. And we're still taking calls at 284-1040 as we're having our fun history quiz on this Independence Day weekend with Don Walton, the author of Our Weird, Wonderful Ancestors. And Don also is an expert on Norman Rockwell. He wrote a book called A Rockwell Portrait, which was Rockwell's biography. And, Don, you were friends with Norman Rockwell.
Yes, we were business associates. The company I was with bought many things, designs from him.
What can you tell us about him? Since you seem to love uncovering things that we don't know about people, what can you tell us about Norman Rockwell?
Well, he was a wonderful guy. We enjoyed working with him for about 10 years. I'd see him about once a month, actually. And then I got to realize that many people thought he was a hick who lived in the North Woods and didn't know anything or anybody. And it was, of course, was just the opposite was true. He's a world traveler, knew people all around the world. He's the only person I ever knew who could call up the President of the United States and get him on the phone with no problem.
Well, some people, though, consider his art too common, and I think as time goes on now, I think they will grow to appreciate it more.
Well, there's a big exhibit, as you perhaps know,
right.
that's traveled
in Washington,
to several cities, and the museums who disdained him before are now showing his works and saying, gee, it's really very good. Of course, when he painted certain pictures, portraits, he painted like Hals or Rembrandt. I mean, he was a fantastic artist.
Mm-hmm. Let's get back to the phone lines with Becky on News Radio 1040 WHO. Good morning, Becky.
Good morning.
Here's your question. Washington's grandson built Arlington, Arlington Cemetery?
Yes.
Arlington National Cemetery. Well, where the cemetery is, Washington's grandson built that and gave it to his famous son-in-law. So who is Washington's grandson's son-in-law? Was it Ulysses S. Grant, Andrew Jackson, or Robert E. Lee?
Oh, wow. Robert E. Lee.
Well, you got that. That wasn't so bad.
That's correct.
But what an odd connection, Don, that Washington's grandson's son-in-law was Robert E. Lee.
That's right. Well, of course, they were in Virginia. They were Southerners, and his grandson was starting a military career, which got to be quite a military career in a later war.
And then the fact that Robert E. Lee owned the Arlington where the National Cemetery is.
Yeah.
All sorts of information in our Weird, Wonderful Ancestors. Becky, you stay tuned to WHO, okay?
Okay.
John's up next on WHO. Hi, John. Turn your radio down low if you can.
Oh, okay.
And let's get a question for you. Who is the youngest of 17 kids of a Boston candle maker? Who is the youngest child of 17 kids of a Boston candle maker? Was it Ben Franklin, Paul Revere, or Thomas Jefferson?
Ben Franklin.
You got it. He was the youngest of 17 kids. And Don, he did awfully well for being the youngest of all those kids. You'd think he'd kind of get lost in the shuffle there, but you had told us earlier he only had 2 years of schooling.
That's right. When he was 10 years old, his father said, that's enough. You come to work in the candle factory. And he would have ended there in obscurity, except that his brother got into the printing business, and he borrowed young Ben as an apprentice. And, of course, that opened up a whole world to Ben.
Wow. Let's take one more call. Carl, you're up next on WHO. Hi, Carl.
Hello.
Who tied with Thomas Jefferson for the presidency? Now, I didn't know this. I'm sure this is probably in some history books that I have read, but I didn't know it. Who tied with Thomas Jefferson for the presidency of the United States? Was it Hamilton, Ben Franklin, or Aaron Burr?
Boy, I'd have to say Hamilton.
Nope, wasn't Hamilton. But thanks for trying. The answer, Don, is who?
Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr tied for the presidency, and later he was tried for treason.
Yeah, they had about 20-some votes, and it kept getting tie. And finally, a man that Burr knew very well, in fact, had worked as sort of a business partner with him in the law in New York, Alexander Hamilton, swung the vote to Jefferson. And that's one reason that led to the fatal duel, because Burr never forgot that.
A couple other quick subjects, Don. Gambling. I mean, we're not just talking about playing cards like George Washington did.
Oh, they were big gamblers.
There was the thing called bear baiting, where you'd gamble on bear baiting, cockfighting, bull baiting. What are all these things, and why in the world did people do this back then?
Well, they were gamblers. Of course, anybody who came over from England and took this 1.5 month or 2 month voyage, what might kill them, was a gambler in the first place. And then life was rough here, so they just gambled on everything, on cockfights and whether the bull would kill all the dogs or the dogs would kill the bull, and just all sorts of things like that. And lotteries, too, were very big.
Yeah. Well, the first lottery was back in 1612. This was when the king was trying to set up the Virginia Company, and he
wasn't going to spend his own money.
Sure.
He had a lottery that financed the Virginia Company, which sent ships over.
Mm-hmm. Don, one more question. Should we know the private lives of those we elect? You have gone back a couple of 100 years and uncovered some of the seamy side of our ancestors. But should we today know their private lives? Are these the kind of things that should be public?
Well, I think so, and of course they are more and more publicized. I mean, during the Eisenhower and the Kennedy years, there were many things that went on that the press kind of just suppressed. They turned the other way, even though they knew what was going on. But that's not true anymore. I mean, it's obvious that any candidate for high public office is under the microscope instantly.
I think what amazes
in those days too, but we kind of wiped those out in the history books.
What amazes me is you're telling me that people did know that about the politicians back then, and that they didn't care, just kind of like what's happening today.
Yeah, I think so, and I think life was maybe a little rawer and rougher then than it is now.
Yeah.
Of course, you have to realize too that at least half and probably 3/4 of the first initial settlers who came over here were indentured servants who were little better than slaves. They were often shipped out of English prisons to get rid of them, sometimes in chains, and sent over here, and then they were indentured to work for a certain number of years.
Right.
It might be 4 years, or if you were a poor person who just signed an indenture, or if you were a prisoner, it was 7 years, and if you were a prisoner who had been sentenced to death, and there were hundreds of those, why then you had to serve for 14 years,
right.
And you might not survive that term of labor.
Well, the book is filled with all these details. It's subtitled Soap Opera Stories of Life and Love in 1776. Title is Our Weird, Wonderful Ancestors. Don, thanks for being with us, and happy Independence Day weekend.
Thank you.